Hello everybody, my name is Dratnos and welcome to my Spec Spotlight for the Elemental Shaman. This is the series where we go over specs in Mythic Plus and talk about what to expect when you're playing with them in your group, or if you're considering playing as them at some point. Now, Elemental Shaman isn't super represented at all levels in the ladder, but actually some of the world's best keys are done with an Elemental Shaman, and I think that they are an underrated and underappreciated spec. I think they're actually fantastic, so let's talk about why. Elemental Shaman damage can be very well specialized. They can move towards single target or AoE, but traditionally in Mythic Plus, they land a little bit more on the AoE side of the spectrum, where they're really happy if they have 5 targets, because that's the target cap for Chain Lightning, and it works really well, their rotation does, if they're hitting at least that many targets. Elemental Shaman's cooldowns are a little bit of an interesting point. There are many short cooldowns and many different cooldowns in the Elemental Shaman kit. It's pretty easy to end up with Stormkeeper on a 1-minute cooldown, Blood of the Enemy on a 1-minute 30-second cooldown, Azara's Font of Power on a 2-minute cooldown, and Storm Elemental on a 2.5-minute cooldown. So syncing all of those up can be difficult to do. Now, of course, not all Shaman play all of those things, and you can use essences like Vision of Perfection to move around the Storm Elemental cooldown. But for the most part, those cooldowns are pretty impactful, and lining those up can be really big damage for Elemental. So I'd say that they are fairly cooldown dependent. Again, nothing like a Fire Mage or anything, but on the cooldownsy side of the spectrum, and happier to be on cooldowns than not in cooldowns. Most range specs tend to be more on the ramping up side of the spectrum than on demand, as far as their damage goes. Elemental Shaman, that's also true for, although less than a lot of the other range specs. Their damage can be pretty early in their, the first few globals, especially when they're planning to use their cooldowns on a pull. But they often are happy setting up some dots and casting some builder spells at the start of a pack as well, and so their damage can sometimes ramp up also. Okay, let's talk about all the utility in the Elemental Shaman kit. Chief among their utility, I'd say, is Wind Shear. Now, Wind Shear is a 12-second interrupt that can be cast at range, and it's a unique ability among ranged DPS specs. A 12-second interrupt compared to the 24-second interrupt that the next best range spec has is massively better, and there are many spots where having an Elemental Shaman in your group is going to be way better than having any other range because they're still able to get a kick. Now, in some ways, it can be a little bit worse than some of the other kicks. Wind Shear has the shortest lockout associated with it, so certain enemies will recast sooner and may even get an extra cast in and require an extra kick in their rotation anyways, due to you using Wind Shear on them, so that is something that in very specific situations can be a problem. But generally, the best part about Elemental Shaman is that they actually don't cost you a kick in the same way that many of the other range specs do, and that means you can even consider playing them with other range specs in your group, because you still have that melee length kick, even better than a melee kick, in Wind Shear. They also have Earth Elemental, and Elemental Shaman's Earth Elemental is even better than Restoration or Enhancements because it's directly controllable by the Shaman, so they can move it around. You can, other Earth Elementals might keep mobs in Sanguine or whatever, or might attack their on target, and the Elemental Shaman can actually directly control their Earth Elemental. One thing that's also worth noting is that the Earth Elemental comes with a shield wall, so when the Elemental Shaman has their Earth Elemental out, they get to also use a shield wall at some point during its lifespan that will affect both them and their Elemental. So in very specific, tyrannical circumstances, say you have a Dire Ritual cast going on the Heartsbane Triad, that's a spot where an Elemental Shaman may fire off their Earth Elemental just so that they can then shield wall off of it and survive the damage that way. They also have Thunderstorm. Thunderstorm is a knock. It's a powerful knock that is centered on the Shaman, and it's a little bit less good than, say, Typhoon. Typhoon is Typhoon is a nice short-range knock that's very easy to control. It's very easy to make it so that if you want to move a mob from point A to point B precisely, Typhoon will do that. Thunderstorm a little bit less easy to do that, especially if there's a lot of enemies. It can be hard to move them all in the same direction, have them all end up in the same place. But it can work. A well-played Elemental Shaman can do a very good job with Thunderstorm of interrupting things, helping your tank kite, or just moving mobs to where you want them to be moved, or just using it up against, if the mob is close to a wall, you can just Thunderstorm them right into the wall and use it as a pseudo-interrupt. This is also particularly useful against Tides Emissaries. Elemental Shaman having both a Thunderstorm and a kick. What you can do is you can, target the mob you need to kick, and then you can Thunderstorm in the middle of the pack, and the Tides will get knocked out and nothing else will, and then you can kick the mob that has an important cast going on. That particular play pattern is extremely useful on many Tides pulls. Elemental Shaman also have a real Bloodlust, as compared to the otherwise you'd have to use drums, so real Bloodlust is better and doesn't cost you any gold to buy the drums, so that's nice. And they have an AoE stun in I forget if they've changed the name on this. It used to be Lightning Surge Totem. I think before that it was Capacitor Totem, and I think again it's Capacitor Totem, but I can't prove it. I think that this is one of those abilities that they've renamed and then renamed back. Anyways, they have it. It's an AoE stun totem. It has a little bit of a wind-up time, but that can even be useful. For instance, on Merectha, the second boss of Temple of Sithralis, before the Knot of Snakes goes out, the Elemental Shaman can drop their AoE stun totem, and then even if they themselves get stunned, they can remove it with their stun totem, so that's a pretty cool little interaction that comes with it. In general, it would be better, obviously, if it's stunned immediately, but, it can be useful, and you can call out, like, okay, I'm, dropping my totem, and then everybody can prepare for the AoE stun to happen. They also do have an AoE slow totem, although that isn't used all that much. There are some spots where it's good. Obviously, if your group doesn't have a slow and you need to drop a slow, that's useful too. They also have Hex. Hex is different from other CCs in that it'll take quite a bit of damage to break through a Hex. So if a mob happens to accidentally get hit by a Blade Flurry charge or whatever, or just happens to take 1,000 damage from some weird effect, that's not necessarily going to break the Hex, which can be good or bad. It means that it's easy to... it's better if you don't want to break the CC, but if you do intentionally want to break the CC, your prop warrior can't just throw a weapon at it to break the Hex. They'll actually have to charge in there and Thunderclap or whatever and melee attack it before the Hex breaks. So upside in some cases, downside in others. They also have an offensive purge and a spammable offensive purge. Unlike, say, Demon Hunters, which is on a cooldown, Elemental Shaman can spam a purge button. So they can spend 5 globals, for instance, and remove all stacks of Soul Fetish from enemies in Waycrest Manor, which can be a very useful thing if you have an Elemental Shaman in your group, because otherwise those mobs tend to kill tanks. And they can dispel curses, which also mainly comes up in Waycrest Manor now that I think about it. There's some curses that go out there, but in other dungeons too there are curse effects, and Elemental Shaman can dispel those. It is worth noting if you're playing with pugs, there's a strong chance your Elemental Shaman does not have Curse to Spellbound, so don't rely on that. They also can do a fairly solid amount of off-healing, just with their own healing surge casts, or they can even talent into more of it with Ancestral Guidance, which is a button where they can press it, and then the damage they do gets converted to some healing on the group for the next 10 seconds as well. That's not too much extra healing there, but it can be useful in some tyrannical boss fights. I'm thinking of bosses like Galvazd and Overseer Korgus. Those are spots where an Ancestral Guidance at the right time can be pretty useful. That talent row is on a pretty contested tier, with other good options being Nature's Guardian and Windrush Totem on that same row. So you may see your Shaman picking either of those other options as well. They also have Tremor Totem, which can be useful in King's Rest and Ataldazar. Maybe there's some other dungeons where there are fears, but those are the two that jump to mind. The best spot for it is Razan in Ataldazar, where you can just tell your group, every other Terrifying Roar you don't actually need to hide for, I'll just drop a Tremor Totem. And that can even mean that you can fight the boss away from a line of sight spot if you need to for a little bit, and you're not rushing to get back next to a line of sight spot. It's also useful on the second Raptor of King Dazar in King's Rest. You can use it to break the fear out a little quicker there, although that's only a 1.5 second fear anyways, so turning that into half a second or whatever isn't really doing all that much better. The last piece of utility I'm going to talk about is Reincarnation, or Ankh. This is a once every 30-minute effect that the Shaman gets, where when they die, they can instead just stand right back up where they were. It still costs a death, so it still takes 5 seconds off your death timer, but this can be useful. Generally, it's just kind of used where, the first time the Shaman dies and it's an important pull and they need to be alive in it, they'll just press their Ankh button and get back up. But you can also use this for skips, so you want to, run through a bunch of mobs and then the Shaman can just Ankh and res everybody afterwards, or res the healer who can then res everybody. And that can be a useful way to save some time in dungeons. Groups don't often do this. Groups often just prefer to leave the Ankh as a Shaman survivability tool, but it's definitely worth thinking about. Okay, let's talk about the main builds for Elemental Shaman. The Essence Major you'll usually see is Blood of the Enemy. It's possible you might play with a Shaman who hasn't grinded it out. That's always, it's an annoying grind, right? 30,000 honor in Battlegrounds is a lot. So you may play with a Shaman who has something else in that slot. Something more single targety like Condensed Life Force or Crucible of Flame, or maybe they'll play Focusing Iris if they don't have this, but generally if a Shaman does have access to Blood of the Enemy, they'll play it. It synergizes really nicely with the kit and can give them a really good burst window. As far as minors go, there are a few options. Vision of Perfection to reduce the cooldown of Storm Elemental and line it closer up with Blood of the Enemy is something that works nicely for them. Other options are Purification Protocol, which is a good solid damage proc, or Conflict and Strife, just consistent versatility. Generally, you'll see Shaman play Blood Major and 2 of these 3 minors. Key traits for Elemental Shaman are 3 Igneous Potential. Igneous Potential is an extremely strong trait. It both increases the chance for you to get Lava Burst procs, which are a lot of your damage, But even beyond that, that's just what the first trait does. The second and third just increase your lava burst damage, and it turns out that point for point, this trait is worth so much damage. So usually 3 is really good. 1, Tectonic Thunder in Mythic Plus is also really good. It adds a little bit of damage to Earthquake and also gives Earthquake a chance to let you cast a free Chain Lightning without having to, you can cast it while moving, which is really nice. So usually you'll want to, Shaman will play as many Igneous Potential as they can get their hands on, and 1 Tectonic Thunder. Now, one problem with this is that there currently aren't many pieces in the game that actually have both of these traits on them. So it can be a really hard challenge to get all of these. If you're not willing to drop item levels, then the only way to get it in the game right now is with PvP azerite. So you need to get up to 2100 or higher in PvP to get a chance to roll those pieces that have both of these traits on them. Other options are Benthic Shoulders, upgraded all the way, but then even then that's only 435. Or the Hard Mode Helmet from Mechagon. Both of those are also Igneous Potential Tectonic Thunder pieces. The good news is that coming with Nyalotha in patch 8.3, looks like there is going to be a raid piece with both of these traits on it, so next tier at least we should be able to see Shaman having these pieces without needing to PvP for them. The most common trinkets you'll see on Elemental Shaman are actually just the raid trinkets. All 4 of them even see play. I'd say that 2 of the really good ones are Ajar's Font of Power and the Aquapotent Nautilus. Ajar's Font of Power, again, pretty easy to use. You just use it before you're going to use your Blood of the Enemy, Storm Elemental, whatever. You just charge up and then you go into a big pull. You can even channel while in Ghost Wolf, which can be useful. That, if you can then sit in Ghost Wolf and that gives you a damage reduction, and you may even have Pack Spirit traits healing you in Ghost Wolf, and you can channel your Ajar's Font of Power that way and be a little bit less likely to have to cancel it to run out of an effect or something that is happening at the start of the pull. The Aquapotent Nautilus is a little bit hard to use. Getting full value from it can be tricky, so many people don't like it for that reason, but if you do get full value from it, it does a tremendous amount of damage throughout a dungeon. And the other raid trinkets are also good for Elemental. Leviathan's Lure, just big amounts of damage, a little bit more single target weighted, but just the sheer amount of damage it does throughout a dungeon is enough to justify it, even though it doesn't scale particularly well into AoE. And the Shiver Venom Relic, again, fairly anemic damage compared to, a well-optimized Nautilus, I'd say. But it does have the added benefit of making any Brewmasters using Shiver Venom Lance get some extra damage also, so that may be enough to take it over the top. And also a very easy one to acquire as it just comes off the first boss, so you may be able to get it on Mythic item level more easily than any of the other pieces. Okay, let's talk about some of the specs that go well with Elemental Shaman. One interesting thing about Ele Shaman is that even though they're a caster, a lot of their damage comes from Earthquake, which is physical. So they actually synergize with both Demon Hunters and Monks in that their damage, the overall damage they do throughout a dungeon is fairly split between physical and magic. They're happy to have either of these specs in their group, and they're really happy to have both the specs in the group. Beyond that, there are really no specific synergies or tensions to mention. It's worth noting that you can play them with another ranged. Even though you can do that, it's not particularly popular for it to be done, because even though you get, you're not going to run out of kicks, the metagame is so melee heavy right now. Outlaw Rogues, Havoc Demon Hunters, specs like that are just doing so much in melee these days that it's pretty hard to find another slot for a spec that isn't one of those, like all the range specs. But it's definitely possible to play some wacky comp with, Elemental Shaman Fire Mage or Elemental Shaman Shadow Priest or even Elemental Shaman Beast Mastery Hunter. Those sorts of combos could work in high keys in ways that Fire Mage Balance Druid or Fire Mage Shadow Priest, those 2 specs going together would have serious problems and serious tensions in the group, and Elemental Shaman doesn't run into those. Thanks for watching my episode here on the Elemental Shaman. Let me know what specs you'd like to see next. I'm trying to make 2 of these videos per week, so subscribe to my channel, like the video if you enjoy it, and I'll continue to make them. Also check out my Twitch stream at twitch.tv/Dratnos. Thanks everybody for watching. I'll see you in the next one.